thank you everyone for joining us here this morning to our follow-up grants workshop, budget walkthrough, and Q&A. If you were able to attend our workshop last month, you learned a lot from our team about grants. They covered where to locate funding, best practices for researching funding opportunities, how to approach writing your project narrative, and there was a great primer around the principles of building a budget. If you missed it, or if you'd like to review any part of that, the recording is now up and the link will be placed in. Of course, wait a couple hours before you do that if you're here with us. Our format for this session will be very different than the grants webinar on January 30th. We're going to begin with a quick review of the budget principles that Debbie introduced, but then we're going to give you a practical walkthrough of both our budget worksheet and justification. I encourage you to download our budget form from the link in the chat so you can follow along later. The last portion of this presentation will be a Q&A where you can ask any burning questions you might have. We will not be recording that part of the webinar. If you have a question and you don't feel comfortable asking it, please feel free to DM me or email any member of our team. Our contact information can be found on our website, which will also be placed in the chat. Before we start, though, it's my pleasure to introduce our new project support specialist, Sheila Scott. She joined us late, sorry, not late. She joined us actually a couple weeks ago, but she brings a wealth of experience as a contract and budget analyst from the Burnett School of Medicine at Texas Christian University, a senior auditor at the Defense Contract Audit Agency, and as an officer in the United States Navy. So here's Sheila.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that introduction. Good morning, everybody. I am so happy to be here. I can't believe it's been exactly 2 weeks today that I've been a part of this team, and it's been absolutely wonderful. So I look forward to working with all of you. So for this portion of the presentation, I'll be providing a quick overview or a quick review of the budget primer that Debbie did on January 30th. There was a lot of content that was covered, so I'm just going to spotlight a few things to remember as we go along today. Next. So first of all, federally funded programs are funded with federal funds, of course. The funding that we provide to awardees must adhere to the federal guidelines that specify the types of costs that are allowable and allocable to federally sponsored agreements like the NNLM Region 3's subawards. These governing guidelines are known as the cost principles, and they specify the cost that can be charged to a federal award only if it is allowable, reasonable, and allocable. Additionally, the items must be treated consistently across the award. And you say, what does that mean? So if you identify an item, a line item as a direct cost, you cannot also identify it as indirect cost for the same exact item across the award. So no double dipping, no double charging. And while you can consult section 7.9 of the NIH grants policy statement, a good place to start is our RFP itself. Next slide. For example, we specify as a restriction that food, promotional items, and furniture are not allowable expenses. Next slide. So what are unallowable costs? So here are some examples of unallowable costs. Entertainment, food, personal expenses. One of these really resonated with me with my experience as a Navy officer. As a Navy officer, I was responsible, one of my roles was being responsible for the tracking and monitoring of budgets and incurred costs. I served on 2 ships, and on one of the ships, I recall the captain, he wanted to know if it was okay to buy tires for his personal vehicle for his personal use. And absolutely not. So, but I couldn't say that. I had to give him some information like we are with you today citing the governing authority and why it was not unallowable and what the basis was. And in general, the basis for this one did go back to the cost principles, allowability, allocability, reasonableness. At the end of the day, what it drew down to was it reasonable? Did it make sense? Ultimately, it was an unreasonable request. Next slide. So when we're talking about reasonableness, it really goes back to, does this make sense? Are we going to use this in the scope of our project? Would a prudent person pay for this amount or include it in the budget? I remember another experience I had as a DoD, a Department of Defense contractor auditor, and we would have to review the incurred cost reports. In other words, they're saying this is what we did with the money and this is how we used it. And sometimes it is reasonable to pay, let's say, several $100s per screw. In the case with a lot of contractors, things are new and you'll have non-recurring expenses. And sometimes things are made by a sole source, a special screw made with special equipment, made with special materials, and only Joe Bob's machinery can make this particular part. And so what the difference is that as long as you can justify, what you deem reasonable, it really helps. For the sake of your proposal, you've got to make sure that you can back up your costs with quotes, historical data, receipts, wages. Sometimes funders will even require you to have a certain number of quotes. And in that instance, when I was working with a defense contractor, the federal government did require at least 3 bids. So be sure to back up and document, have a basis for what you're including ultimately in your budget, budget justification. So let's talk about direct costs. Next slide. Here, I won't read verbatim what this slide says about direct costs, but ultimately any direct costs you charge should go towards your scope of work or the program that you propose in your submission. For example, if travel support is being requested, consider what benefit is the travel providing to the project. How does that travel fit into the overall scope of the work being done? Travel should not be requested if it's unnecessary to the scope of work. I was working with a contractor in my previous life, as Brian has mentioned. It was an international project, so there was a lot of travel involved with that because it was international and also nationwide. It covered many boundaries, many states, countries, and nations. So be aware that direct costs, they should fit within the scope of your work. And as Debbie had mentioned in the January 30th webinar, the funder, as is the case with NNLM Region 3, wants to be sure that their money, in this case, the taxpayers' money, is being, used in a good way and intentionally used. So your success is our success. And for additional details on any of this, I want to repeat what Brian had emphasized. Please reach out, ask questions, use this time to have, a Q&A chat in the chat, and we'll get around to making sure that we provide you with the resources that will help you with this. Because the whole point of this is not to make you experts, it's to give you what you need to do your job a bit easier. Next slide. The budget, also I want to emphasize the budget narrative or the budget justification. Brian's going to give you a walkthrough of that. But once you have figured out all the costs of your project, your budget will essentially look like this. You got your salaries and wages and fringe. And I want to reemphasize here that once you put it together, have you thought about the cost principles? What should be here is here. What should not be here is not here. So making sure that it's allowable, allocable, consistent, what is identified as direct, making sure it's only direct and not double charging it elsewhere in some other category of costs. But Brian will do a walkthrough of this document and the budget justification, which is also known as the budget narrative. And what the budget narrative is, it tells a story. It's literally a story about what you need and why you need it. Next slide. It's extremely important that you know that what you have in your narrative is what also mirrors your budget, your simplified budget. So making sure that they equal one another. They're pretty much reflection of the other. The justification provides the applicant with the opportunity to show a clear understanding of how the anticipated and requested costs will support the aims of the project. So it's extremely important that you get this part right. Next slide. So I want to emphasize that a properly constructed justification is both detailed and concise, ensuring that the reviewer has a fully fleshed out idea of what your financial needs are for your proposal. And it can get extremely, tricky and kind of complicated. So again, I want to emphasize that don't be afraid to also ask your funders questions. That's what they're there for. They want you to succeed. So there are no silly questions, and they want you to use their resources and their insight because they're the ones who are wanting you to have this resource for what you want to accomplish. And also, I don't want to forget to mention this. It should not, the budget narrative, also known as the budget justification, should not introduce anything new at this point that has not been previously mentioned. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Brian now. But the most important thing to do, if you were unsure, I want to emphasize again about anything we're discussing today, ask questions. That's what we're here for. Brian, thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Sheila. And I know we're going to sound like a little bit of a broken record here, but please do ask your questions. I know some of you might have come with questions unrelated to anything that we're currently talking about. Go ahead and put that in the chat if you'd like. We are collecting questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I hope you did get a chance to download the budget form that was put in the chat a little earlier. But I'm going to go ahead and share that now, and we're going to talk about the different components of this budget form, and then later we'll also take a look at a mock budget justification. So what I did is I put together a fictional budget and fictional budget form. This is what the spreadsheet looks like. You'll notice that it looks a little different than what we've had in the past. Every year, we try to think about how we can improve upon these forms that we use. We know that we demand a lot, but we have been able to work with our Office of Sponsored Projects to get this form produced for us. What I have done, so this is what it should look like. I've gone ahead and annotated it. So I'm going to go ahead and share an example. By the way, everyone can see what's on everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. So I decided to annotate this budget form. And actually, this is something you could do if you're trying to make notes for yourself, because I realize even this budget form by itself, when we look at this original tab, which is what you probably downloaded, isn't always, this isn't always the most clearest document to look at. So all I did was I clicked on the first column. This was originally A. I hit insert and I started to annotate each of these sections, and it will not affect any of the calculations in the form. So I was able to type in different fields, and if you scroll over to the right, you'll see all your cumulative totals still will load correctly even if you add a column using Excel. The first thing to know is that you should not fill out the gray shaded forms. These are automatically calculated based on the information in the light gold shaded cells. So I'm not going to go philosophically into each of the principles too deeply. Debbie talked in depth about what it means for things to be allocable or allowable, talked about person months and calendar months dedicated to an effort. I'm just going to show you how I might fill this out if I was trying to create a program. So I've already pre-populated this with different people, different roles, and you'll see that the calendar months have not been filled out yet. But I want to point out a couple things about what I did fill out. So I have a direct role, and oftentimes, not all the time, you'll have a person that is giving guidance on the project, and you want to make sure they're included because their insights and their experience might be really crucial to the project, or it might be the role or person that helps convince the funder that your project is one that's going to succeed, but they don't actually necessarily request any salary. And you can still include them in the budget form, at 0 salary and 0 months, because they're not requesting any time. And we'll see a couple more examples of this. But typically you do have one or more persons that do have effort and time and money that are committed to this effort. So just as an example, I've already figured out their base salary, or rather I made up a base salary, and we're going to say that the number of calendar months that they're dedicated to this role is 3 months. And if it will let me type it in here, oops, not 33 months, we can see that it automatically calculates their salary based on 3 months. Your own organizations may have rules around how you can enter this in. When we're submitting our own subawards or budgets, we're often very much working closely with our OSP or whoever our accounting department would be to get these numbers in. Same with fringe rate, which again was covered in the last webinar, but I'll talk about a little bit later when I get to the budget justification. But I'm just going to go ahead and put in 10% here, just so you can see that that it automatically calculates your fringe benefits. You also might notice, you also might notice when I put in 3 calendar months, it automatically populates percentage of effort. So this is based on 12 months effort or a 12-month year or a 12-month appointment, however you want to think about it. So it just does it just does a simple division here. So 3 out of 12 is 25%, right? Usually you only have maybe a couple people that are listed as key or senior personnel, 1 or 2 people. Lots of other personnel if they're part of your project team, or maybe you're a small organization. You don't have a huge project team, so you might just have 1 other person that's working on this. Again, this is I have the information I have to the left here. It's exactly what we've talked about before in past webinars. I just decided to annotate it. As you're going through this, as you learn about the budget, I encourage people to, make notes, make comments on whatever documents they're working on. Because these budgets are so complicated, I find that I need a lot of notes to keep track of everything, to make sure that I'm not forgetting costs that I want to incur, or ideas for costs or people that I'd want to include on the project. But we're going to go ahead and say that this person, Douglas Ramsey's 3 months, and again, you see these calculations automatically populating in the gray cells, and then you have the total salary, wages, and budgets that are calculated down here. So as we mentioned before, equipment usually refers to large lab equipment or capital equipment, acquisitions over $5,000. When we talk about purchases that support outreach, like iPads or handouts, those would really go under materials and supplies, cost under Section F. You might have general purpose equipment like desktop computers or laptops. That's likely going to be used on multiple projects or for personal use. So they really shouldn't be listed under They shouldn't be listed as a direct cost, but they should come out of your F&A costs or your indirect costs, unless the laptop or computer you're using is being exclusively used for the conduct of this project. And I would say that for many organizations, it's usually not the case if you're only talking about a project that's lasting anywhere from 3 months to an entire year. Travel, and we're going to see this all broken down when I talk about the budget justification. Travel should go toward direct outreach. Travel shouldn't be really going toward just learning about the trends in your field. But it should be going toward direct outreach or direct programming. We use GSA rates to determine lodging allotments, mileage rates, and daily per diem allowed. If you're unfamiliar with GSA rates, actually, I'll just go ahead and put those in the chat myself right here. You can look them up. We're always looking up GSA rates for our own travel to figure things out. I think I heard someone say something just now. I'm not sure if someone was trying to interrupt me or say something, but I don't hear anything else, so I'll keep going. For the purposes of our grant, for the most part, Section E participant training support costs aren't really applicable for the type of funding that we offer. But again, if you are interested in other types of NIH grants or federal grants, you can find information about this in the grants policy statement about how you might use those. Well, I want to talk now about other direct costs. I think this can be a little bit of a confusing section sometimes. So you may notice that the gray cells, like we said, that don't fill out the gray cells because they automatically populate. But we have other direct costs, and we list a number of categories in gray cells. And that's because this is kind of a controlled vocabulary. These are set categories that we have to submit. So whenever possible, you're not going to necessarily see it here on the actual budget worksheet, but when you are thinking about your materials and supplies, they might be subcategories that you include in your budget justification. So we'll see that in a second. So this 1160 right here is the total number of funds that you're going to request for materials and supplies. But in my fake budget justification, you'll see that there are actually 3 or 4 different items that are in there. So your budget narrative is really where you flesh out each of these sum totals, but these are set categories, so we don't change these. This is just how they get entered into our system later. I've gone ahead and I've stricken some of the language here because they're really just not applicable to our award. So as part of our award, you're not going to be giving away your own sub-awards or having a consortium agreement, but you might have contractual costs associated with whatever you're trying to build. You also are not able to use our funding to make alterations or renovations. However, if you do have questions about this, or you're unsure if what you're doing counts as this, please let us know. Just to reiterate, from last time on the 30th, or if you weren't here last time on the 30th when we had our big grants webinar, our projects should be going toward new outreach programming. So the projects that we fund should not be used to engage in your normal business or normal operations. So we don't fund anybody to just keep doing what they're doing. We fund people to do programs in which they want to incorporate a health component in a new way. And then there are, of course, costs that are not allowable. We already talked about this. For instance, you cannot take your team to a VR gaming experience or throw a party with catering. And just like Sheila's example, Just like you wouldn't pay for your personal groceries using a company purchasing card, you also shouldn't purchase your own tires for your vehicle, or any of the other items that we've mentioned before. But again, go to the grants policy statement for, it's not a comprehensive list, but it's a little bit of a fuller list of allowable and unallowable costs. IDC gets pretty complicated as well, and Debbie went into this on the 30th. If you are in an academic institution, such as a university, it's likely that you have pre-negotiated IDC rates. Some larger organizations might have a negotiated IDC rate. Many organizations do not, so you can use a 10% de minimis rate, and this can be useful for purchasing things that aren't allowable under federal funding. Like food or promotional items. I just would not list these types of items in your budget. You might mention that your institution covers these as part of your programming. You all can't tell, but I'm used to gesturing. So even though my camera isn't on, I'm gesturing very wildly right now, and feeling a little silly. But anyway, so this is kind of what the budget worksheet is going to look like. And then when you're finally done, you can see all your costs if you scroll up, but also on the right side, you'll see all your cumulative totals have been added up here. And for our particular grants, which are either, for our big grants at least, that are due on March 1st, those are either going to be $8,000 grants or $25,000 grants. Section I, that final total, so your direct costs plus your indirect costs, has to be under either 25,000 or under 8,000. So I was very careful to make sure that this fell just under 25,000. Does anyone have any questions about this budget worksheet so far? Of course, we can always revisit this when we get to the Q&A section after we've turned off the recording, so that's fine too. So now I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the budget justification. So again, this is a fictional budget justification. Sorry, one second, I lost the window. So as a fictional budget justification, I did not flesh it out as much as I could have because I'm not trying to write a proposal myself here. But these can get much longer and these descriptions can get much longer. I just wanted to be able to build something that would give you an idea of the type of information that you might want to include. We don't provide specific examples or model examples, because really what a budget justification and budget looks like for every organization is going to look different. Some people have templates that they like to use. Some people like to organize their budget justification in a certain way. We have a lot of people that review grants. We have reviewers internal to our team. We also have external reviewers, and everyone has sort of their individual preferences. For me, sort of a rule of thumb is I like to keep things organized. I hate having to look for information or understand where costs are coming from. There isn't a particular rule about how you put these budget justifications together, just really a set of principles that were discussed during the last webinar that we had on grants. But something to realize is that we're talking about a budget justification. So this is the thing that underlies or supplemental to your project narrative, to your large project proposal. So like Sheila said, we shouldn't be adding new information. I shouldn't be surprised that, oh, there's this person that's working on that, or they're going to have this travel, this program. I should have been reading about that earlier in the project proposal. And then when I get to the budget justification, maybe I see a little bit more details fleshed out, but I'm not surprised by any activity that's being described here. oftentimes if you're writing a budget justification or filling out that budget worksheet, you're really switching between both documents, and maybe even switching between what you wrote in your project proposal. These are long documents, or they can be long documents, right? So you always want to make sure that you are covering what you said and you're not adding new ideas. I think that personally, as a writer myself, the more I write, the more ideas I get. So I always get this temptation of, oh, this is a really good idea, I should include that. If I do that, I need to make sure that I add it back to my project proposal, right? So what I like to try to do, or personally what I like to see, and I'm not the one reviewing all of our grants, we have a very talented team that does that, and external reviewers that help us with that as well. But when I'm looking at a budget justification personally, I try to organize it according to the budget worksheet that I've been given. So you can see that I've made some annotations here. Match the headings in your budget sheet as you write this. I think that you'll just thank yourself later, rather than just try to get out a bunch of narrative around your budget items and then get it to refit the budget worksheet. So as you can see, sometimes we do get roles that are short like this. Sometimes we get roles that are a half a page each, where they really try to flesh out the description of what that person is doing. But again, as long as you're not adding new information, like if you never mentioned that you have volunteers that you use, you shouldn't be mentioning it here, because this would surprise us. We would look at this and say, coordinate volunteers from the community volunteer database. What volunteers? What are they using volunteers for? This is, again, not the place to introduce new information. I personally like to see with every section, make sure we include your subtitles. It's sort of exactly how we have it in the worksheet here. So I tried to design this budget justification to be very linear. So we have our senior and key personnel, that just like we described in the budget worksheet, and we have other personnel separated by the same heading. And then we have their total salary, wages, and benefits that are described right here, and include the total for each section. So sometimes you're not going to have headings that actually have any cost associated with them. Sometimes I like to include them just because I'm trying to signal to my funder that I have thought about it and I don't need it, or I'm just trying to keep track of things myself, because I know the budget worksheet has an A, B, C, and D section, and I know that Microsoft Word will automatically format, letters in order. So I just put NA here. So, and I didn't even check my annotation to the right. So I already wrote that. This is not necessary, but can help you organize and check your justification against your budget worksheet. Travel. So in your budget justification, it's important, and this is just straight out of NIH policy statement and guidance, include the destination, the number of people traveling, and dates or duration of your stay for all anticipated travel. And then, as Sheila said earlier, travel has to be directly related to your proposal. And I just made this up right here because, again, I'm trying to emphasize that we don't like surprises in the budget justification. So I wrote here, again, there aren't rules about how you write these narratives necessarily, but I just want to make sure that communicating to my funder that I had written something in my project plan around this. And if you had gone through my maybe 8-page proposal or 4-page proposal, and I kind of forgot that they talked about travel earlier, well, then this is really helpful for me. So, think about how you communicate, use every piece of your application as a communication tool. So I wrote, as mentioned in my fictional project plan that doesn't exist because I made this up again, we're going to have 2 mini health programs in the city above, or maybe we're going to have it, and maybe we don't know what the cities are, but we're planning on Kansas City. If we don't have it in in Kansas City, then maybe we'll do it in a similar one that is That is my nod to the Super Bowl, by the way, even though I didn't actually get to watch it. So, maybe I want to include other information. It never hurts because you never know what sort of information reviewers are going to be looking for. So costs, so I wrote that costs were calculated based on GSA rates. Lots of times, some of us have traveled enough where we can just eyeball travel and say, well, yeah, that looks about right based on GSA rates. But some people might actually look up the GSA rates for lodging and mileage and per diem for that city. So if you can include this here, it helps us know that you've done your due diligence when you're trying to calculate pieces of your budget. Participant trainee support costs, again, typically not applicable with all awards, but I think the most important thing to look at right now are other direct costs. So like I said with the budget worksheet, all of those categories under other direct costs are kind of set categories. That's what our OSP wants from us when we submit budgets, when they're putting together their subaward contract for the proposals that we've accepted. But your budget justification is where you flesh out those categories. So under materials and supplies, you saw that on the worksheet, I had 1160. Well, this is where I flesh out those items. So I'm pretending that we have a full color NNLM banner that maybe you're creating, maybe you have on-site signage with a QR code. Sometimes what people will do is they'll include a quote at the end of their application. Maybe they've already talked to someone. The more information you can provide, again, the better. It's not always necessary, but the more fleshed out we see what we're looking for, in part, aside from an innovative program or interesting program that we think is going to be impactful, as we're looking for feasibility. Do we feel like the organization that's applying is really one that is thinking out these processes and putting something together? For instance, if you're purchasing workbooks because you're having a symposium or something, and that based on past experience that you have 50 or 100 participants for the sessions, well, maybe you've described the workbook already in the proposal, and you already have quotes for what printing these will look like. Well, maybe you also want to include a sample of the booklet in a fake appendix that does not exist. So in my project proposal, and again in my budget justification, I would just keep referring back to see sample booklet in Appendix A. Things like consultant fees. So, sorry, let me not skip over publication costs. So you might find it funny that even though we might be printing out a banner here, or maybe we're trying to print out workbooks for participants, why don't we put that under publication costs? And the reason why is because lots of the projects that are funded, or lots of grant funding, that especially happens at an academic institution, is going toward research projects, not outreach projects. So that makes our program a little unique. But when we talk about publication costs, we're actually talking about the costs associated with disseminating research findings. Most other types of costs, and I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about equipment, it's actually going to be a material or supply. Anything that you're printing, anything that you're shipping, any hardware that you might be purchasing, the majority of it is going to be materials and supplies. If you're not sure, you can always create a category that says other, and you can add to that budget spreadsheet. You might have seen it, that there was space to add a few more lines, but for the most part, if you can try to fit it into one of these set categories, that's what I would do. Okay. So consultant services. So these are going to be things like if you're trying to hire, if you're trying to do something like a keynote speaker fee. I'm just going to stick with the example I have rather than try to riff. So we're going to pretend we have, Dr. Henry Hank McCoy is going to be our keynote speaker. You have things like this, then it would go under, it would probably go under consultant services. And again, I like to include, they say that they're going to get Dr. Henry Hank McCoy, but do we actually know that they got Dr. Henry Hank McCoy, or are they just being very aspirational? So if I can get, it doesn't necessarily always have to be a formal letter of commitment, but if I have a communication from Dr. McCoy, then that's what I'm going to do. ADP/computer services, and this is typically referring to computing power. So in a research project, this might be use of a supercomputer. For a project that you're doing, it might be something like ArcGIS, which is mapping software, or GIS software that you might be using for some reason or another. Or it might be just processing power. Maybe you have a more sort of digital outreach type project. Those might be the type of services that you put under here. And then, like I said, moving on to the next category, subawards and consortiums. I'm just going to go ahead and strike that through because we're not doing that with our awards. But if you have a contract with someone, so if you're trying to hire a designer to do some work for you, or people that are working for you but they're not employed by your organization, that's where those costs would go. They'd go under contractual costs. So again, I tried to flesh out enough information about what this person is doing, so I can show again that we really thought about these costs, the costs of doing this project. And then again, I have something here that says see attached quote Appendix C for breakdown of services. So you can add as many appendixes as you want. If you look at our actual RFP and grant application, you might see for certain parts of the project there are page limits. But if you have a few more appendices, that we have no limit on those. So yeah, and then you can see I tried to be very predictable, very linear. I always have the subtotals even for these individual items, and I add them back up. If I'm ever putting together a budget worksheet or a budget justification, I have a calculator. I'm holding up a calculator right now. You can't see it. I have a calculator. I'm constantly just adding on my calculator to make sure that everything looks right, that these costs look right. And then at the very bottom, I total everything up. And then I'm switching between this and my grant worksheet to make sure that the costs line up. And if I make any changes at all, I know it's been ingrained in me that I need to keep switching back and forth between my budget worksheet I actually have to submit and this budget justification. And so we have 22,610, those are total direct costs requested. We have our indirects at 10%, and then the total direct and indirect costs is 24,871. And then if I go back to my budget form example, we see the same exact numbers, 24,871. So we're all good here with this budget. So that is it for the walkthrough. And so we can go ahead and stop the recording and answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.